Okay, so good morning. And this is actually something I did many years ago. And this time, as it is a larger audience and we have more time, I really expand on it quite a bit. And in doing so, every time I discover some new information that are quite interesting. So the presentation is going to be split in two major parts. The first is the history of the early nativity scene, but mostly relating to the nativity scene. And what comes often together is the adoration of the shepherds. And the second part will be the adoration of the Magi. And so it's a different topic. As you know, the celebration comes another day, and we'll talk about that. So let's look at the history. Oh, that's my mouse again. It doesn't connect correctly. Okay, before we start, I wanted to show you uh, what probably was the setting of the Nativity, which was not a cave, but probably in the stable part of an Israeli house. And here you have a little model of what would be an Israelite house. At the ground floor, on the ground floor, you would have the stables with the animals living. This is a courtyard with an open roof, and then the habitation for people would be on the upper floor. And so this is probably down there in that stable that Jesus was born. The very first representation of the nativity scene is very, very simple. It starts quite early, but as we know, all the characters that we hear about, like the wise men and the shepherds, are not really biblically accurate. So the only places where we have some narrative about the nativity comes out of Matthew and Luke, and they describe Jesus' birth. Matthew mentions wise men, while Luke comments on shepherds. So we have uh, just two short description. But nowhere in the Bible do the shepherds and wise men appear together. And no one mentions donkey, oxen, cattle, or any other farmyard animals in conjunction with Jesus' birth. The sources for the animals alluded to by the book of Isaiah. In the ox knows his owner, and the ass his master's crib, but Israel doth not know, my people does not consider. And in the 7th century, we have a similar text in the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew that says, and on the 3rd day after the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ, Mary went out of the cave and entering a stable placed the child in a manger, and an ox and an ass adored him. Then was fulfilled that which was said by the prophet Isaiah. And we repeat, the ox knows his owner, and the ass his master's crib. So this is really information that the only information we have that goes back to a prophecy one with the book of Isaiah, and then a repeat, if you want, in the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew. In the tradition, the ox traditionally represents patience, the nation of Israel, and the Old Testament sacrificial worship. Of course, the ox was often the subject of a sacrifice. The ass, on the other hand, represents humility, readiness to serve, and the Gentiles. They also regarded by Augustine and Ambrose as representing the Jewish people weighed down by the law for the ox, and the pagan people carrying the sin of idolatry, the ass. So Christ was arrived to free both from their burden. So in this sarcophagus that you see, which is an early Christian sarcophagus of Flavius Stilicho, we have there on the side a little scene that represents more or less the first extant image of the Nativity. And as you can see, Mary and Joseph are nowhere to be seen, but you have a child tightly wrapped, lying near the ground in kind of a wicker basket, and he is surrounded by the oxen and the ass. This, by the way, if you ever go to Milan, is in Sant'Ambrogio and is now the part of the base of the pulpit in San Ambrogio Basilica. So here is the sentence by Isaiah. And the one by Habakkuk, also in the midst of the two beasts, with thou be known. Patience and humility, these are the two information. And we'll find that later on, for example, often because the donkey represents pagan people, he often turns their head away from Christ because they don't recognize Christ. In an early ivory triptych, we have there a very typical representation, Byzantine representation of the Nativity. Mary is only shown actually at the very beginning, only shown when you have the Adoration of the Magi. In this case, we have shepherds around, and we have the baby appearing twice. Mary is reclined. She has just gone through birth, through the delivery, and we have the baby, again, very tightly wrapped, surrounded and kept warm by both the ass and the oxen. Angels are around there, but they are telling the shepherds that Jesus is born, and so the shepherds are going to be on their way. At the bottom of the little triptych is the view of Joseph, who is kind of thinking, how did that happen? And then we have what is supposed to be a wise woman, who is a midwife, who is actually bathing the child in that little basin. So again, we have, don't forget, at that time, a lot of symbolism was always present in these. So in fact, in the Annunciation of the Shepherds by the angel, this represents the spreading of the message of Christ to the Jewish people. Now, the Adoration of the Magi means that actually it's the spreading of the message to the heathen people. Here's an early mosaic from the Palace Chapel in Palermo, Sicily, that shows the Nativity with shepherds and magi. This is often early on what happens. And we have a similar view again, Mary being reclining, but this time she almost holds the child that is still laying down on the stone. That looks very much like a church, by the way. And so just comparing Jesus and the church and her, we have the shepherds coming with their gifts on the right, and then the kings, the wise men, coming from far away. Again, Jesus appears twice. He appears with his mom, and then he appears with the midwives down below, ready to be bathed in that beautiful big vessel. And this is, by the way, the image that is going to be perpetuated by the Eastern Orthodox image to this day. Now, the setting that we see there is a cave. And actually, it's the specific cave of the Nativity in Bethlehem, which is, as you know, shown underneath the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, and is now a place of pilgrimage. Above it is a little mountain. And then what we can see very typically is the sun, the light there shining with a straight line down to the crib. Very early on, these type of scenes were represented in mystery plays, and we'll talk about that a little later. But very early on, from the 4th century on, there are mystery plays in the churches. Once it becomes too crowded, they will move outside of the church. One of the great examples that was a great source of inspiration for many artists is the pulpit by Nicola Pisano in the Pisa Baptistry. And one of the faces of the pulpit, the octagonal pulpit, is the scene of the Nativity. And as you can see, this is absolutely copied from a Roman sarcophagi. It's actually inspired by Phaedra, a sarcophagus that was showing the history of Phaedra. And so Mary has been copied there, and it looks very much like a Roman Matrona. She has, again, the Jesus all bundled up on the side. Unfortunately, the oxen and the ass have lost their head with the time. And then at the bottom, we have Joseph, and then the midwives taking care of Jesus. And then surrounded by the shepherds. The same story is shown by Pietro Cavallini. Cavallini was a Roman artist, extraordinary. Unfortunately, we've lost most of his work. He was both a mosaic designer and a painter. He did some beautiful frescoes. He also did one of the early lives of St. Francis that unfortunately were lost not too long after he painted them because of the demolition of the church. In the Basilica of Santa Maria in Trastevere, we have in the choir an incredible display of mosaic. And one of the scenes, and it's the one here behind the altar, is actually shows the Nativity. And in here, we have the Nativity with the shepherds. As you can see, the angel telling the shepherds that the star shines on Bethlehem where the Christ is born. This is, again, still very Byzantine, but it is tinted of a Roman style, particularly in that young shepherd, which is playing the horn to his sheep here. And it's a very pretty little scene where that young boy is there, and then the little dog is watching. In Greece, for example, in the amazing series of monastery churches that are in Mistra, that's a hill that's covered with different churches, we have, again, that same representation, typically Byzantine, of the Nativity with the shepherds and the kings coming on horseback, angels there telling the shepherds that Christ is born. You can see the ray from the sun coming, and then the shepherds on their way to worship Jesus, and Joseph, as usual, being kind of the side. At the bottom, you can also see the midwives taking care of Jesus. So Jesus always represented twice. This is really a representation that's going to endure in the Orthodox Church. And all the way to the 15th century, early 15th century, we see that icon by Andrei Rublev, who was one of the greatest icon painter in Russia in the 15th century, where he was so celebrated. You see that similar image that endured all the way in the 15th century, when we will see in the other parts of the world it's going to change drastically We see the Magi coming, angels celebrating, Jesus warmed up by the ass and the oxen. And then we have the arrival of the shepherds on the side. Joseph still always sitting on the side, not quite sure of what just happened to him. He's actually consulted by an old man in this case, and then the midwives taking care of the children, the child. This kind of panel in the Orthodox Church would be part of an iconostasis. And this is an example, a very beautiful example of the iconostasis in the Cathedral of the Annunciation in Moscow. That dates back to about the same time. It was partly decorated by Rublev, but mostly done by Theophanes the Greek. And these little panels would be up here in that tier, which shows different important feast days during the year. Others would be always, you had the Theophany with Christ, Mary and John, and then angels, and other scenes that are more typical and relate to local saints. These are separating, these iconostases, the choir, the altar, from the regular public. And when a service would be held, they would open this door that would just give a glimpse of what's happening in the choir. In the east, in the west, sorry, we see an evolution. Of course, with Giotto, nature becomes more realistic. In this case, it's still pretty bare. Mary is laying down, but now Jesus is very close to her, and she seems to be taking care of Jesus. There's still a midwife, though at that time, the midwives are going to gradually drop out from the Western description because the theologians disapproved of what they called legends. Sometimes just the bass remains and then takes another signification as baptism and so on. What I love in that scene is just the different expressions and position of these angels, still very Byzantine because they're only partially shown, just the upper part of the body, and then the shepherds that are stayed on the side. In Siena, Ducho di Buoninsegna is going to also show an evolution in that interpretation of Nativity. This is a piece of the very famous Maesta that is in Siena, that huge altar piece that unfortunately was partially dismantled when it fell out of favor, but can still be seen. And as you can see, some of the parts went in different museums. This one is the National Gallery in Washington. So now Mary is not completely reclined, but almost seated, if you want, on her couch. The baby is there with the oxen and the ass. He appears again a second time with the midwife. So as you can see, it's on the dropping out of the midwives is only going to be gradual. And of course, they're surrounded by the two prophets, Isaiah and Ezekiel, who both prophesied the arrival of Christ. With Ducho, we have now a bigger attention on the space. And slowly we see an apparition going from a cave towards a stable. And in here he makes a compromise. He has a stable built within a cave. So that's an interesting point. In the north, we often see at the same period, this is a painting by the master of Vichy-Brod, shows Mary, that it becomes much more sentimental, much more affectionate towards the newborn. And she's literally holding the baby against her, though down below you have the midwife and Joseph both putting some water in the bucket to be ready to clean the baby. And the shepherds, following the announcement by the angel, are on their way to celebrate. And we have here, in this case, a donor who is kneeling down, as you can see, much smaller, and showing a church that is probably commissioned to be built for the Nativity. This is again part of a large altarpiece that was dismantled. But I really like the closeness of Mary and the child. There are legends attached to some of these panels. This is a Flemish painting, we don't know who the author is, representing the Nativity, but as you can see, what is interesting, down in the corner where the rest is pretty similar, though the baby is now shown naked, not anymore wrapped up in the cloth. We have Jesus, we have God appearing on the very top. But what is really interesting is Joseph there. As you can see, he shows a bare foot. What he's actually done, that he's cut part of his thigh tight, and is preparing it so that he can put Jesus in to keep him warm. And this was part of the story of Joseph's stocking. In the Middle Dutch and German Christmas carols, even nowadays, they tell the story that Christ's child was swaddled in cloth cut from the undergarment of Joseph. And Aachen Cathedral in Germany once owned a relic said to be Joseph's stocking, which were the subject of an intense veneration around 1400. So this corresponds to that legend. I think it's really cute too. In the Konrad van Soest Nativity, we see another interesting story that shows actually Joseph preparing a fire so that they can eat something warm, and really have a beautiful sense of color and gesture in that early piece. As you can see, Joseph there on his knees with his cheeks all puffed out. So this is really the idea of a very earthly life, and the shepherds are shown on the back. And by now, as you can see, we have a stable. We were talking about the mystery plays, and this is literally something that started early on and went on all the way to the 16th and 17th century. And actually, in some places in England, they still do it regularly. They first were developed in medieval Europe. The name comes from mystery in the sense of miracle. They were at first played by the clergy itself until the Pope decided to prevent them from doing so. And then the plays became performed by the craft guilds. They were focusing on representation of the Bible stories first in the churches as what they called in tableau vivant, the idea that you had some actors representing a scene like the crucifixion or the Passion or the Nativity around Christmas, and you had actors just staying still and representing the thing. Then it was accompanied by some songs, and they started performing, and they were literally part of the guild, what you call the rhetorician, were actors part of the guilds, and they would perform. And this was the early theater plays, if you want. And you can see two representation, one in Metz in France, where that whole building there is actually that kind of theater. And if you look well, it represents very much what we see on triptychs with Retablos, where we have different series of the life of Christ, of the life of the Virgin that were represented. And you can see how many people it attracted. This one shows a mystery play in Flanders where you have a stage just next to the church. They were first said in Latin with an introduction in the vernacular, in the local language. But the actors themselves were saying the verses in Latin. The introduction was done in the local language so people could understand what was going to happen. So these played quite an important role because a lot of the painting you're going to see are in fact inspired by some of the plays that they saw the artists saw themselves. Another great influence on the Nativity is actually Saint Bridget of Sweden. Saint Bridget of Sweden, who was born in 1303, as you can see, was a very popular mystic. And shortly before her death, she described a vision she had of the infant Jesus lying on the ground. And I said her words there. The Virgin knelt down with great veneration in an attitude of prayer, and her back was turned to the manger. And while she was standing thus in prayer, I saw the child in her womb move, and suddenly, in a moment, she gave birth to her son, from whom radiated such ineffable light and splendor that the sun was not comparable to it, nor did the candle that Saint Joseph had put there give any light at all. The divine light totally annihilating the material light of the candle. I saw the glorious infant lying on the ground, naked and shining. His body was pure from any kind of soil and impurity. Then I heard also the singing of the angels, which was of miraculous sweetness and great beauty. And this is very interesting because she's going to have a tremendous impact on the iconography of the Nativity. And from the end of the 14th and then the 15th century, we see a complete change in the representation of the Nativity. So here is a first one. It's a small retable in Germany that shows very much what she's talking about, showing Mary now kneeling in adoration in front of Jesus and Joseph holding a candle, but it's lit up, but doesn't show really light. And what you see around the child is supposed to be the light emanating from baby Jesus. So this is what the impact is going to be on the St. Bridget's vision. Similar is the view in the Nativity from the Très riches du Duc de Berry, that extraordinary book of hours by the Limbo Brothers. And we have again that scene. We now have, as we said, a stable that is not in good condition, and we'll talk about that. Mary is kneeling down. Jesus is surrounded by light, as you can see. He's actually even lifted by some angels. And on the side, we have Joseph. He doesn't show any candle, but what he shows that is actually mostly found in German representation at that time. He wears a Jewish hat. In Italy, his Jewishness is mostly going to be shown by the fact that he wears a yellow coat. But here he has that conical hat, which was the headgear that Jews were forced to wear in Italy to differentiate them from the regular people. We see the angel announcing the birth of Jesus to the shepherds, and an absolutely lovely landscape by the brothers. Often St. Joseph is going to be regarded as an old man, often asleep. Sometimes he can be rather comical, and according to what we know in the mystery plays, he was often the kind of a clownish figure. Though very quickly in the North, he's going to they're going to develop a cult to Saint Joseph, and he's going to become a much more traditionally sound figure. Very unusual is the representation by the master of Flemal, who, by the way, is the painter with whom Roger van der Weyden will study. In his Nativity, we see again the couple kneeling, adoring the Christ. Unusual are the fact that the oxen and the ass are turning their back to the Christ. But the stable, it becomes really kind of a ranch-hack little building, and this now is taking the meaning of the old synagogue. It's the fact that this is part of the Jewish denial of Christ. So the synagogue is falling apart, but the birth of Jesus is going to change it, and with Christianity will bring salvation to people. Really beautiful scene. It's one of the first that shows that very beautifully crafted landscape with Jerusalem at the back, the sun hiding behind the rocky formation there. And an additional story that is told by all these beautiful, what we call phylacteries, these scrolls that come, that the angels are carrying, are always so beautifully meandering through their hands. We have the shepherds in the background with their musical instrument and very modestly witnessing that incredible miracle. And there we have the midwives, including this one that, as you can see, is showing has a hand that's paralyzed. As you can see, the hand is just falling off, and she can't use it. And in that phylacteries, she hears a voice saying, "Tangue puerum et sanabaris," touch the child and you shall be healed. And so that midwife that is handicapped there, by touching the child, will be cured. The light is absolutely beautiful, and just the shadow. This is a very, very important and influential painting. The sun, of course, represents the symbol of renewal and redemption. In Italy, with Andrea Mantegna, we see that evolution in the mid-15th century. We just saw that in my Tuesday class, is that incredible understanding now of the perspective and the integration of the figures in a very believable way. We have, again, Mary kneeling down in front of Jesus. Jesus is lying down on part of her beautiful blue coat. There are little cherubs all around that are taking care of him. The oxen is only showing on the side. Joseph, as you can see, is on the side, half asleep and wrapped into a yellow coat. And the shepherds are coming. And this is a painting that really shows by then the influence of Flemish paintings. It's the detailed landscape at the back, the details of the plants, the realism of all these plants on these rocky formation, and the much more rugged face of the shepherds, which are not idealized as the other figures are, but show that these are people living a pretty hard life. Mantegna, when he was working at the court of Ferrara, had the chance of studying works of Roger van der Weyden that were collected by the Ferrara court. Different view. This one is the work of Andrea De La Hobia. This is a terracotta or glazed terracotta work, showing a very simple view of the Nativity, just showing Mary and the child, and then a whole series of angels and God the Father on the very top, with the dove representing the Holy Spirit. So we have the figure of the Nativity of the Trinity. This actually decorates a part of the Chiesa Maggiore in Laverna, Laverna being the place where St. Francis had received his wounds. So this is one of the sanctuary that are in Laverna, where Francis received the stigmatas. From the same family, and is Giovanni De La Hobia, is an evolution on the taste. This is already 16th century, and with the new generations of De La Hobia, we see instead of just a bicolor, we now have multicolor, polychrome retablos. This one is in the Bargello in Florence, but showing now a much more complicated scene with Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, John the Baptist, who is going to be the precursor to Jesus. We have both the oxen and the ass, and at the back we have the shepherds and all the angels around it. Again, very influential is this painting by Hugo van der Goes. Hugo van der Goes was a painter, northern Flemish painter, but that spent part of his life in Brussels in a convent, and unfortunately died there very young. He received, before entering the convent, he received a commission by the Portinari family to paint this beautiful triptych that had to be sent to Florence and decorate their chapel in Florence. Portinari were actually envoyed by the Medicis, by the bank. They were working for the Medici bank. At that time, Hugo van der Goes was in Bruges. And so we see actually the two donors on the side with their patron saint. But what we really want to focus on is that marvelous representation of the Adoration of Christ that is again full of symbolism. So first is a change that is going to happen is that not showing anymore just a little shed. He's now showing a ruined temple that is actually a temple in the Romanesque style, but it shows again the dilapidated state of the Old Covenant of the Jewish law. The decor is supposed to represent Bethlehem, and we have the Holy Family joined by the shepherds that form a circle around the newborn. So the newborn again is naked, is radiating light, as you can see. Mary is really meditating. She is not a happy mother because she can foresee the sacrifice that Jesus will have to go through. What is extraordinary is in this view is first the rendering of the shepherds. As you can see, the shepherds are really rugged-faced people living a difficult life. They're not at all idealized. We have a series of angels floating around, hovering over Jesus and shown around. And in fact, if you look at them, they wear the typical liturgical vestment as to help the new priest to celebrate his inaugural high mass. And the new priest is Jesus. So you have all the people, all these angels around that are there to assist him. They wear chasuble, cope, dalmatic, and stole. In front of Jesus is a sheaf of wheat that alludes to the incarnation and to the Eucharist. And of course, as we find often in northern paintings, these symbolic flowers that are all related to the suffering of Christ in the Passion. We have columbine, irises, lilies, and then smaller flowers there. we can see that Joseph has removed his shoes because they are on sacred ground. So they have to go bare feet. He's set on the side. We have the ass and the oxen there. And if you can see, it's really difficult. In the very back, in the darkness, is the face of Satan. And Satan becomes the witness of something he wasn't expecting at all. He's witnessing the birth of Jesus, who is going to come to save and redeem our sins. He was up to then benefiting from the fact that nobody could go to heaven. He was the one that was getting these souls. So he's absolutely stupefied. And we'll see in other paintings in the north how this has an impact on the iconography. This painting, when it came to Florence, came by boat and then was processed literally through an amazing pageant to Florence, where people rejoiced at the idea that that great masterpiece was entering their city. And it became of a tremendous influence on Florentine painters, and then later on painters from other places that are going to look at that very incredible detailed rendering of the fabrics, like that cope worn by that angel, the beautiful rendering of the fabric, the beauty of the fabric, but also the realism of the figures. Here's some of the beautiful flowers. One of the first one who is going to benefit from that influence is Domenico Ghirlandaio. Ghirlandaio, with whom Michelangelo is going to study for 3 years. In that particular Adoration of the Shepherds, as you can see, he shows the shepherds on the side there with totally different faces than they would have been shown before, because they become realistic. So realistic that actually Ghirlandaio is portraying himself as one of the shepherds. And he is pointing at Christ as that new arrival. Change in this work is the building. As you can see, the roof is falling apart, but you have these magnificent columns that follow a little bit the popular compilation of the golden legend that the night of Christ's birth, the Basilica of Maxentius in Rome, supposed to house a statue of Romulus, had partly tumbled to the ground, leaving the impressive ruin that survives today. And so this is, if you want, in relation to that temple. Also, the manger is no more just a little basket or whatever, but it's a sarcophagus. And we see in the background both the shepherds that are told by the angel and the Magi that are coming in procession with the view of Jerusalem in the background. So we have here a multiple stories, so what's called a continuous narrative, where here are the shepherds told, but they are also here. It's absolutely a beautiful rendering. And Joseph, as you can see, is clad in yellow. And looking at what is all that noise that I can hear, Mary in total adoration, a beautiful Mary. In 1500, Sandro Botticelli painted that very bizarre, mystical nativity. It really has something that no other painting, neither by Botticelli nor any other, has. Is kind of a vision of events inspired by the prophecies in the Revelation of St. John. So you have something in front of you that is absolutely non-realistic at all. You have Latin and Greek text that are inserted in the painting, and then a very hierarchical scale for Mary and child. The baby Jesus is enormous, as you can see. But if Mary was getting up, she would go straight through the roof. Again, you have here a combination of a stable and a cave. So it goes back to earlier representation. And then the whole series of angels and other people that are coming. We have angels embracing figures here in the front, and little devils coming out of the ground, like kind of not believing what they can see. And literally a garland of angels there, that actually these relate very well to what Brunelleschi had built to make this tableau vivant. He had that mechanic garland, if you want, that would turn, moved manually by some people in the background. They would attach all around that some young kids that would be angels and would make that kind of garland that is represented by Botticelli. The text is interesting. It's probably a painting that was painted by Botticelli to be on his grave. As you know, he died rather young. And he says, I, Sandro, painted this picture at the end of the year 1500 in the troubles of Italy, in the half time after the time, according to the 11th chapter of St. John, in the second woo of the apocalypse, during the release of the devil for 3.5 years. Then he will be chained in the 12th chapter, and we shall see him buried as in this picture. So this relates to St. John's revelation. It is also painted in 1500, and don't forget, for many people, 1500 was going to be the second coming of Christ. As he didn't come back in 1000, they thought that he would come in 1500. This is quite an interesting painting, and actually the half time after the time means half millennium, so 500 years after the millennium, 1000 years. From that time on, the iconography is pretty much settled, and we'll see different ways. We'll have caves, we'll have ruined temples, and we'll have some stables. But the figures of the shepherds and the Virgin Mary and Joseph is pretty set. This is a painting by Giorgione, the Adoration of the Shepherds, that is in the National Gallery in Washington. One of the very rare paintings of Giorgione. Beautiful landscape, very, very typical of Giorgione, with the soft colors and soft atmosphere of Venetian paintings. In the north, one of the artists that really made most of these representations, mostly in engravings, wood blocks, and sometimes in drawings, is Albrecht Durer. And he repeats some of the things he has seen in Italy, the idea of the ruined temple, of the ruined synagogue, that serves as the background for the scene. We have here that the Adoration of the Shepherd, showing Mary, the baby, Joseph being kind of on the side, but it becomes quite an architectural search. The same with the second one, where you have a beautiful perspective of that building that is very much a typical German house that we can see through, so on that kind of a terrace. And then Joseph is getting water from the well. This probably, by the way, shows a date. And the idea would be that this was actually an important point, is that New Year's Day was celebrated on Christmas Day at that time. And so this probably was made as a particular scene for New Year's of that year in 1504. And then the beautiful nativity scene drawn, this time by Durer in 1514. So it's quite a way away. He made many others. I just picked these three. By Gerhard David, again, we are in the north. And as you see, I'm going chronologically, not by region, because definitely there is an interaction between both. So here we have, again, a focus on the mystery of the incarnation. As you can see, again, there is a somber atmosphere because Mary can already see the fact that Jesus is born, but with the idea, his incarnation comes as a solution to redeeming our fault by being crucified. Of course, the donors are on the side, and you can see the lovely landscape in the background with the shepherds that are coming and peeking through the window. And the sheaf, of course, of wheat. This refers to John 6:41, "I am the bread which came down from heaven." In Germany, we have these beautiful representation around the same time. One by Albrecht Durer that shows that house completely in ruin, and Mary and Joseph really sheltering under what is left of one floor, and the little angels blowing on Jesus to keep him warm. The very special light also. Similar to Cranach, that with these beautiful skin tones, bluish skin tones that are very particular to them. One of the most complex nativity scene in the north is by Matthias Grünwald in his Isenheim altarpiece. I show you the way it's displayed nowadays in the Museum of Unterlinden in Colmar. It's a representation, it's a triptych in 3 different modes. So when you open this one, the second appears, and then you open the second and you have the third one appearing. And this is depending on feast day. So the second opening shows you the Annunciation. There is a mistake there. The Annunciation, the Nativity, and the Resurrection. And then at the bottom, as the predella, is the Lamentation. The view of the Nativity is quite special because it's really separated in 2 halves. You have on one side Mary rejoicing at the birth of Jesus, with, of course, the great light coming from the heaven. And then on the left, you have a series of angels that are playing instruments, also rejoicing at the birth of Jesus, with the exception of one. And so we're going to try to detail a little bit. First of all, if we look at the size of Mary, she's again absolutely enormous. So we have that particular hierarchical scale that really shows the importance of Mary and Jesus. The crib is replaced by almost a little bed. And then we have the tub where Jesus is going to be washed. And then an interesting feature is the chamber pot, which is quite unusual as a part of that scene. It's uncovered and symbolizes the decay of the ruined tabernacle of David. This is the defilement of the synagogue. And there are Hebrew letters on that chamber pot that makes no sense. They are real characters, but they make no sense. This, together with some of the understanding of the building that we see there, which is supposed to be the Temple of Solomon, shows actually the difference between synagogue and ecclesia. So synagogue being the old covenant, ecclesia being the new. You have that plan that is going up to that part in between, that kind of column. And it's literally the old order replaced by the new. And as you can see, you have that vilification of the Jews that becomes a really important part, particularly in Germany, unfortunately, but sometimes you have it in Italy too. When you see Hebrew lettering, often it's not a positive way. The Jews were considered as responsible of horrible crimes that were depicted in painting. And so often when something was going wrong, who was to blame was that a group of settlement of Jews that were living across the river, and they would go and just demolish it. So this is something that went on for quite a long time. The little cruet, beautiful cruet that you see here at the foot of the column represents the ointment oil that is added to the baptismal water. Now there is a pagan myth about the angel, the fall of the angels. It shows that the angel, that particular angel, Satan, was the most beautiful of all angels, but he believed in his beauty so much that he wanted to be put above the others. And so that caused his fall. And so when God decided that he was betrayed by him and by his rebellion, and then he caused his fall. And what we see here on the left is a very interesting image of not only a regular angels, and then a whole series of strange little angels, some with feathers like people from the New World. But we have that green angel with a peacock crest on his head and decaying fingers that actually represents Satan. Satan completely astonished by what is happening here is the birth of Christ, who is going to redeem our sins, and therefore taking away all these souls that normally would join him in hell. Very different, of course, moving back to Italy. Here's the Basilica of di Loreto. And inside is supposed to be the little house of Mary that was transported by angels to Loreto and is one of the great pilgrimages in Italy. Surrounding that tiny little house is that designed by Bramante, is La Santa Casa, that huge marble building inside the basilica. And that has also one of these views of the Adoration of Shepherds, sculpted by Andrea Sansovino. There's a whole series of sculptors that joined to make that incredible decoration in the early 16th century. And we have a stable and a different view, the kind of an astonishment of Joseph, Mary, who is making sure to keep Jesus warm, and then the shepherds coming to adore him. Bronzino is a Mannerist painter. So in the mid 16th century, you have the beginning of the Mannerist style, where there are some unexpected torsions, unexpected movement, and a change also in the color scheme of painters, but an absolutely beautiful and very soft view of Jesus laying down and then being surrounded by the shepherds. And again, Joseph, as you can see, clad in yellow, looking with astonishment to what's happening, and beautiful cherubs frolicking in the sky. The angel there is again alerting the shepherds of the birth of Jesus. Very quickly, we see in the north change in style with Tintoretto, where we approach the movement and attention of the Baroque. This is an interesting view where we have two levels, and this could be closer to reality, where we have Mary on that second floor with the cattle being down below, and the shepherds are coming and bringing some gifts to baby Jesus. And you have a whole series. You have a peacock in the back, which shows eternal life, and a beautiful rooster, a really interesting light, which is also typical of that approach of the Baroque style. In the north, Peter Artsen, one of the rare painting of that kind. He did some religious painting, but a lot of still lifes too, with a triptych. This is part of a triptych. And you have that view of a very Flemish, strong woman, the two animals on both sides. And this is actually the Adoration of the Magi. I should have put it on the other side. But showing the Magi coming to worship the child. Coming from Crete, moving through Venice and Rome, El Greco, as you know, settled in Spain, in Toledo. And this is one of the very, very many representations of the Adoration of the Shepherd. This one very probably made by him towards the end of his life to decorate his tomb. And you have that very silverish colors that he was favoring at that time of his career, showing that incredible supernatural light emanating from Christ that is the one that illuminates the rest of the scene. Very different is Caravaggio. Caravaggio with his chiaroscuro, his tenebrism, that has that so actually realistic light that you would have in the evening. The angel is coming in beautiful foreshortening down with one of the phylacteries telling the story of what is happening. And we have very realistic rendering of the shepherds with their rugged but very modest view. Mary said, adoring her own child. And we have two saints on both sides. Influenced by Caravaggio was Georges de la Tour, a French painter who has a specialist of these images with candlelight. And this is absolutely beautiful because you can almost see the transparency of the fingers that are guarding the flame, and then people from the surrounding that come with the gifts. To try to feed the parents of that newborn. But at that time, this is an uncommon scene. We'll see that there will be a favor towards the adoration of the shepherds. And Rembrandt's also, that's a very intimate scene in a beautiful but deliberated stable. In Spain, we have Retablos, of course. This is by Gregorio Fernandez, who made some extraordinary sculptures. But this is in the monastery of Huelgas Reales in Valladolid. And another Spanish painter, Murillo, very known for his people from the street. And you can see the rendering and almost actually the affection of the shepherds toward his sheep, his lamb that he's holding there, who is normally going to be sacrificed for Jesus. So I'm going to let you go for 5 minutes. So please, I'm going to reopen the floor. You can unmute yourself, ask me a question, and then we're moving to the Adoration of the Magi. If you have any questions, please go.
I had a question, and this is Joan. I was used to calling them banderoles, the scrolls. You use a different word.
Phylacteries. Phylacteries is a term that comes from actually Jewish tradition, but represents these ribbons that were written on. And this is the exact word. You can say banderoles, but phylactery is the exact word that you use for that.
You. Yeah.
You look very good when you say that.
Oh, good.
They're beautifully blended, and it's typically Flemish, where they have these ribbons that are, just undulating on the scene, framing the scene.
And
Yes.
why is Joseph always wearing yellow?
According to a scholar that made a big study on that, this is only in Italy most of the time. It would be categorizing him as a Jew.
I see.
So it's not universal, but it's very frequent that you find the Joseph clad in yellow. In many cities in Italy at that time, you had neighborhoods that were literally walled in, where the Jews were living, and when they were leaving their neighborhood, they had to wear either a sign or the conical hat that were showing, identifying them as Jews. Any other questions?
I don't have a question, and I have a comment. One thing that I noticed, that I was amazed by the conception of the painters when they painted Jesus, and also the evolution of the conception of the church, because the paintings were approved by the priests before they were produced, weren't they?
Not especially a priest, but a theologian.
The theologians, because the whole thing is evolving tremendously from the beginning to this 1500s.
They are going to, you've seen how very early on you had the midwives, for example, and then that was frowned upon by theologians who said, but Mary didn't suffer, so she didn't need any midwives and people to help her. So you can't show that. And so they were very gradually removed from the scenes. And then you see just Mary interacting with Jesus. So there is a great influence of, it's sometimes through councils. Literally, the Council of Ephesus is going to be the one that's going early on in the 5th century, is going to focus on the existence of Mary. And suddenly you have Mary that comes in. It's not just Jesus and the ass and the oxen, but Mary comes there, you see. So it's really interesting. In the north, you will see a much more sympathetic view on Joseph, because there is a cult that develops on Joseph. And so he's going to be shown as more of a participant than the guy who is on the side and who doesn't really know what's happening.
Yeah.
I have a question, Anne. This
Yes.
is Ed. Hi. Wonderful presentation, first of all. I'm intrigued by the size of the baby Jesus. In some paintings, he looks almost as large as an adult, and in other paintings, he looks like he'd be the smallest preemie ever. So I just don't understand where they get the adults right, but they don't seem to get the baby right at all.
As I mentioned, especially early on, you have that hierarchical scale. So the important figures are shown very big, and then the others, the donors or people that are on the side, are shown much smaller. Sometimes there is, particularly with Botticelli, for example, in his mystical Nativity, this is an emphasis on Jesus. Is huge. I mean, he's almost as tall as Joseph, And so this is literally a decision taken by the painter who wants to make a point. With the time coming by, the proportion is going to be much more realistic. And we'll see the same with the Adoration of the Magi, though that comes a little later. So we already are more used, we closer to the more realistic vision. But yes, sometimes it's really interesting, and sometimes Jesus looks really strange. Sometimes he looks like a real baby. So it's always been a debate about Jesus. The early version of Jesus, particularly in the Sede Sapientiae, when you have the Virgin seated, showing her child. So that's not the Nativity; it's a different thing. Jesus looks like a miniature adult. And he's in fact representing a philosopher. So he has to have an adult face, though he has the body of a baby. So that's these are all interpretation at that time. And these were beliefs that evolved.
But, you know, and for me, what is amazing is that when you explain the symbolism of the paintings, because there are so many stories and so many layers that are for me, I could not see. I could see the central story, but I'll never be able to figure out the secondary stories. And the other one, when you explain the shade or the shadow to be one of the paintings, the shadow was the devil. It never occurred to me to think that.
No, and you have
sort of,
it in the painting by Van der Goes, but it's very difficult to see. You have to see the real painting to see it. And then the one by the Isenheim altarpiece, that's absolutely extraordinary representation of the green angel. And the green is literally a color of decay. So it's Satan decaying because Jesus is there. And you wouldn't believe me, but when I was teaching at ASU, I was showing that because it's such an important painting. And one of my students rose up in the back of, in the theater, and she said, "That was not written in the Bible." And I said, "Sorry, but go and ask him why he did it. I can't tell you. The fact is the painting is there and was made." Yeah, it is not in the Bible, but a lot of things were not in the Bible.
And
yes,
it's Joanne. I have a comment. I find the artists that I like the best are the ones that have the most distinctive, recognizable style. And I don't know, whether that's attributed to the fact that those are the artists I'm more familiar with. Some of the other artists, you can see like a regional style, but not a style that's idiosyncratic enough that you would recognize that particular artist.
Yeah, but definitely once you're familiar with an artist and then you like it, it's going to become much more familiar to you and you're going to grasp him better. If you look at some of these many times, you're suddenly going to become more infatuated with other artists too. And recognize their style. Yeah, that's why I'm mixing North and South, because you can feel the difference. But it's so interesting, particularly in that very topic, there is a great influence between one and the others. So for a long time, the art historians separated the painter from the North and painter from the South, and where, in a sense, because of Vasari, really kind of diminishing the value of the North. And now it's recognized that they had a tremendous influence on the South. Okay, I'm going to go on because I have much more to show you. So I'm going to mute you again, and then we can talk at the end. So let me see if I can mute you. Okay, so the next part is about the adoration of the Magi. And the only person that really talks about the Magi is Matthew. So on entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then opening their treasure chest, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another path. And that, of course, comes after that, the story of the massacre of the innocent. They have a particular feast day, which is the Epiphany. It's on January 6th. And this is celebrated differently in different countries. In France and Belgium, for example, it's the day of the crepes, and you make crepes for the Epiphany. So attached to the legend of the Magi, or the tradition of the Magi, I should say, is another really interesting story, is that the relics of the Magi were originally situated in Constantinople, but then were brought to Milan by the city's bishop Astorgius, who had received them from the Emperor Constantine in 314. And he built a church. A church was built at San Astorgio in Milan, where you have the three wise men sarcophagus, and then a beautiful retable behind it. And I'm going to show you, and that shows different events, including the adoration of the Magi in the very center. And then this is the dream that they have to go without seeing Herod. This is the arrival too. Interestingly enough, in 1164, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa took the relics of the Magi from the church of Sant Astorgio in Milan and gave them to the Archbishop of Cologne. And since then, the three kings have attracted a constant stream of pilgrims to Cologne. And literally, the cathedral was built around the idea of having the relics of the Magi. Of course, the cathedral in Cologne is by now, because it's only been finished recently, the largest Gothic cathedral in the world. And you see here the wise men shrine, which is absolutely a beautiful shrine made in the Dinan region in Belgium. The very first representation of the Magi is quite interesting, because nowhere we have the number of Magi or how they looked. And so at first they represented very similarly, all dressed with what is called a Persian type of clad. So little tunic and a Phrygian hat. They're coming with their dromedaries, and they're bringing gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Because there are three gifts, often their numbers has been limited to 3. But sometimes they appear 4 or just 2. That depends. On the sarcophagus of the Holy Innocent in the crypt of Saint Maximilien Basilica in France, that's the basilica where the relics of Mary Magdalene were too, you have a panel up there that shows also the 3 Magi in a very similar fashion that are coming to bring their gifts to Mary and baby Jesus. In San Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna, in one of the scenes, shows the 3 Magi presenting their gifts. They again wearing some Persian dress and Phrygian caps, and their gifts. Now, in this one is interesting. We start seeing a tendency which shows the 3 ages of men. So we have a young man, a middle-aged man, and an older man. In this Spanish work, we have a carved whalebone, by the way, shows the adoration of the Magi, but really constricted, with a tremendous difference in size, if we're talking about hierarchical scale, of the very, very large Virgin with a very adult-looking but smaller Jesus, and then the kings coming to offer the gifts. And of course, this is that early recognition of Jesus being a king, because other kings are coming to submit to him. In Romanesque church, often you have capitals. This is Saint-Pierre in Chauvigny in France, showing a very typical Romanesque rendering of Mary and baby Jesus in the Three Kings. Again, we're going back to the baptistries, to the pulpits. Sculpted, we'll see two different ones, one by Nicola Pisano and then by his son, that shows a scene of the Adoration of the Magi. And again, there we're going back to the antiquity, is that shift from Byzantine art to the recognition of the art of the past of Italy, with the beautiful classical Roman representation of the kings, where you have the older king, the middle age, and the younger one, and Mary looking very much like a Roman matron. She's again, Pisano, when he was doing that, was looking at sarcophagi that were not far from the baptistry in Pisa. There was a whole series of sarcophagi, and there he got some influence, and that was really a celebration of the past of the city, which had been very closely associated with Rome. His son Giovanni Pisano, who is making another pulpit in Pistoia, shows quite an evolution in the style. And now, not anymore just looking at the past, but he's evolving towards a more realistic representation that is animated differently. And we have here the three Magi and Mary that is, and the Jesus that is moving towards the Magi. Giotto in the Cappella Scrovegni, or the Arena Chapel, as you want to call it, in Padua, shows that the beautiful view of the Magi. As you can see, the age is again differentiated. It's not the same anymore. Mary is in a stable, and you can see the older Magus kissing the feet of Jesus. He definitely had not seen a real dromedary. Ducho in Siena, this is also part, this is the Meister, by the way, that I was talking before. And so these small panels were either on the top or here at the bottom, in the predella, and where we have seen already this scene. And so this is going to be the second scene showing Mary and Jesus, and then the Magi coming to venerate the newborn. This is, by the way, absolutely copied from the pulpit of Nicola Pisano. I think I brought it. You can see the influence. It's exactly the same setting. And so this is just giving you an idea on how these iconographies worked, where a very important work like that pulpit by Pisano really brought a lot of influence to many of the surrounding painters. What you see, unfortunately, is an overcleaning that has removed some of that blue that is a beautiful blue. This is the ultramarine coming from lapis lazuli, but it's very fragile. Another work that is very influential is, of course, part of the doors of Lorenzo Ghiberti. These are the Norse doors. And one of the scenes shows the Adoration of the Magi, again, quite influenced by Pisano. In the north part, again, of the Trésor du Duc de Berry, that beautiful book of hours, we have an Adoration of the Magi that is there, influenced by Italian painters. It's painted in the this is one of the last one painted by the Limbo Brothers before their early death, but shows Mary and Joseph a little bit in the background. Mary is attended by beautiful ladies, and we have the Magi with their entire retinue coming and populating the composition. This is why the Adoration of the Magi is going to become one of the favorite subjects, because it could include a lot of figures, what the painters and the patrons were getting more and more inclined to like. And so here you can see you have the city in the background, of course, Jerusalem, and then all the beautiful standards floating in the wind. And then you have here the angels and the light coming through the roof of the stable. Even if you look, there is a cheetah down below. This is, and another one too there. So this is very much influenced by Italy, where some of the Medici and other rich families had their private zoo at home. And so they were aware of these kind of animals. The very known Adoration of the Magi by Gentile da Fabriano. This is typical of that international Gothic style that precedes and goes early on side by side with the early Renaissance. So you have that love for the gold, a lot for crowds. This is again a continuous narrative where you have the whole cortege of the Magi going to Jerusalem. They're going to see Herod, ask him, say that they had been told that the king was born, and ask him if he knows. And of course, this is going to alert Herod, who's going to say, when you find him, please let me know. And he knew what he wanted to do. Then they find Jesus and they have the dream that they shouldn't go back to Herod. And so they leave by another location. So again, here we have a whole series of exotic animals that you can see frolicking around the countryside and accompanying the whole cortege. This is also going to be a very influential work. Part of a larger piece is that work by Masaccio, is again showing the steps that Masaccio is going to make away from the international Gothic, taking some of Giotto's novelties and making them his own. And so you can see now the real space that each figure takes and the depths of field of his figure in a very small setting. You have the atmosphere also at the back. That is taken from Flemish painters, by the way. They do that at what is called an atmospheric perspective. And you can see that Joseph is clad in yellow again. In the cathedral in Cologne, Lochner had made a beautiful triptych that is celebrating the Magi. Of course, as we said, the cathedral contained the relics of the Magi, and so it was normal to have a painting that would celebrate the three wise men. As you can see, they are still just looking at the age of men. You have young, middle-aged, and older, all bringing the gifts. This painting, again, is going to be very influential because when the next image that you will see by Roger van der Weyden will be asked to paint a work for a German patron, he's going to come to Cologne and look at that painting and look at that particular green, which is pretty unique to Lochner. Is going to be taken by Van der Weyden in that figure there on the side, and it's going to become part of his palette in the next works. This is a wonderful St. Columba altarpiece that was painted for the Church of St. Columba in Cologne, but commissioned to a Flemish painter. It shows again the Magi coming to worship God. It's surrounded by the nativity scene and the circumcision. As you can see, the shack is there showing that the old law and a beautiful detailed landscape, very typically Flemish, an incredible rendering of the luxurious fabric that are cladding the Magi. Then all the detail of the plants at the bottom. This is so very typical and going to be quite appreciated later on by Italian painters too. This is most probably actually a portrait of Van der Weyden himself. In Italy, we have that work that comes at the end of Fra Angelico's life, where he's going to work hand in hand with Fra Filippo Lippi. That beautiful tondo, that round shape work, was at the time the most valuable painting in the palace of the family that commissioned the painting. It's just a beautiful work. The very soft and pastel colors used by both Fra Angelico and Fra Filippo Lippi, but there you have the total idealization of all the people around. Beautiful Virgin, very soft gesture, the manger in the background with the oxen and the ass. Then, of course, the big peacock that represents eternal life. And then the procession of all the people that are coming to worship Jesus. In the chapel of the Palazzo Medici Riccardi is the famous chapel with the procession of the Magi, and that end up with the Nativity. The procession of the Magi was done by Benozzo Gozzoli, whereas the Nativity is by Fra Filippo Lippi. And so let's look a little bit at each of the procession, of each of the Magi. So each is a wall. And so you have the procession of the youngest king, where you have the whole retinue going through the landscape and down from the mountain. Again, we have a whole series of animals. Here we have some deer that is hunted with a dog hunting behind. And then the whole series of people, including some very recognizable figures. This would be Piero de Medici, and then we have Benozzo Gozzoli himself represented in the crowd. And he puts his own name on it to make sure people would recognize him. And here is Piero de Medici. This is just an idealized figure. It was at the time thought to be one of the Medici, but it didn't correspond with any age. In the second one, we have the Middle King, procession of the Middle King. He has been identified as the patriarch of, the Emperor John VII's Paleologus. And here you can see he's got the crown. And he's again in a very typical Tuscan landscape. And here is actually a coin that was done by, who was, I can't remember the name of who made it, but a famous painter and medalist. The last is the procession of the old king that you can see here. Unfortunately, a part of the panel has been cut to open the door. And at that time, we have, sorry, go back there and show him. Here's a portrait. This is a portrait of the Patriarch of Constantinople. And again, so this is all because there was a council that was taking place, was going to take place in Florence, where he was going to be present, and they wanted to just keep the memory of it. So Fra Filippo Lippi is going to paint the Madonna in the forest with the Nativity, and this is also a very different kind of painting that brings in a different figure, Saint Benedict shown there. So this is part of the propaganda of the Medici, but also part of the Christian exegesis with a critical explanation of the text and trying to put together some of the old text and some of the new to try to make sure they don't contradict themselves. So here you have the adoration of baby Jesus by his mother. St. John the Baptist is on the side. And we have the Trinity again with God the Father, the Holy Spirit, and then Jesus at the bottom. And very typical Filippo Lippi representation with beautiful Virgin that's always so pure and so pretty. Could be his future wife, by the way. And we have there the influence of Flemish painters with the beautiful and very realistically represent plants at the bottom. Moving on, we now have a new representation. And now we have the introduction of the black figure of Balthazar. It's only around the time of Mantegna, and we cannot say that Mantegna is the one that did it, but he's the one who's going to have the influence on other painters. We now have the introduction of the Black Magus. And not only are the Magi going to symbolize the three ages of men, but also the three continents that were known at that time: Asia, Europe, and Africa. It doesn't happen immediately for all the representation, but it's going to come gradually. In that painting by Sandro Botticelli of the Adoration of the Magi, we see more actually figures that were going around in Florence, a lot of the Medici family and other rich family that were around Botticelli at that time. And so we have in this painting a reaction of Botticelli, by the way, who is representing himself here on the right, to what Alberti had said, that to really fill the paintings with figures and make sure they interact with one another. One of the most wonderful compositions by Leonardo da Vinci is the one of the Adoration of the Magi, which, as so many works by Leonardo, is never going to be finished. But the beginning of it, as we can see it, is so extraordinary that even in that condition, it's going to have a great, great influence. It shows, again, in this incredible quantity of people that are all interacting. So again, he's responding to what Alberti had mentioned before. We have the beautiful rendering of the horses, and then a great landscape in the back with the temple that is falling apart. So we are going back to that legend, the golden legend and the temple of Maxentius. This work was really studied quite much. We have the perspectival study for the Adoration of the Magi, fortunately, and it gives you an idea how he studied the background and eliminated some of the parts of it, just with all the orthogonal lines that are reaching that vanishing point in the back. So he would work with something like this, and then he would eliminate. He would just position his figures, and then it would be transferred to the canvas or to the panel without the lines, of course. But he knew by that time how big such and such a thing had to be. So it was not painted a la prima, as will happen in the 17th century. And now the representation, I'm now going to show you many representation. Here is by Filippino Lippi, the Adoration of the Magi, and you can see that we now have the apparition of more at the back, but he's not part of the Magi. Here are the Magi that are all white people. But again, we have figures there, part of the patrons that commissioned the work. Again, influence of the European paintings. By that time, they had seen the Portinari triptych, and you have that much bigger variety of faces, with faces that are not idealized anymore. In the north, here's by Gerhard David, the Adoration of the Magi. Takes place in the ruins of a palace. The Virgin is seated on the edge of the manger. And then you have, again, that very realistic rendering of the beautiful fabrics and much more realistic faces, everyday faces in the different figures of the paintings. But we see also exotic costume, by the way, the turban and so on, shows that these people were coming from other countries and other regions. Albrecht Durer made this. This is one of his most important painting, The Adoration of the Magi, that had been commissioned by Frederick the Wise of Saxony, who was the elector of Saxony at that time. He himself then gave the painting to the Emperor Rudolf in 1603. What Durer does is, again, really framing the whole work with the architecture, the arches, and really good perspective. He had been to Italy, so he was aware of the whole mathematical formula, if you want, for the work. And just the introduction now of the Black Magus is quite certain, but you also have that interest of Durer into all the plants and the insects. You see insects and plants that were absolutely perfectly rendered and that are part of his word and his passion. He is actually introducing himself there as the younger of the two white magi, sorry, with the long and curly hair, as he liked to represent himself. Hieronymus Bosch is known for his monsters and very wild composition. In one of his more regular religious rendering, he has the triptych with the Adoration of the Magi, the two donors on each side. But as you can see, the landscape corresponds. It's a similar landscape for all of them. And here you have the Virgin, a very large Virgin, by the way, and tiny baby that are that is seated and waiting for the Magi to come and make their offerings. A different offering is actually a little sculpture, a little group of sculpture showing the sorry, just the sacrifice, the Isaac sacrifice. So sacrifice of Isaac, which is a prefiguration of the Christ sacrifice on the cross. So different interpretation. And then there is really the introduction of a figure that we not sure what it is, but it's a half-naked man that is hiding in the back of the stable with a crown and very rich clothes that just hides his nudity. And we believe that it could be Satan looking at, again, that miracle that has just happened. Now, probably one of my very favorite is this extraordinary work. It's called a prayer bead with the Adoration of the Magi and the Crucifixion. Now, I want you to realize that the height of just this part, because this is a bead, it's going to be closed. The size of this is 2 1/5 of 16 inches. So it's not even 3 inches in the height. Incredible rendering and very intricate composition here of the nativity scene with 2 wings showing other stories that are related to the birth of Christ. This is supposed to close down as a bead like this and be part of a rosary, as you can see, held by the fingers of that man. It would be part of a rosary. This one probably part of a rosary for the Ave bead, which would be the rosary, so for Hail Marys. And he would just open this and then meditate on the image he would see. So I'm going to give you a rendering. So you can see the detail for such a tiny, tiny little object, but just an incredible composition. So we do believe that they were using what they called, there were no lenses yet at that time, but they were stones that were polished and were curved such enough that they could look through and see some details when they were carving. I absolutely adore these prayer beads. Correggio, that extraordinary artist, it has that sfumato that was developed by Leonardo, but comes a little later and is really that link between the high Renaissance and the late Renaissance with all the movement and the much more natural settings that we saw before, which were more contrived. And here we see definitely the introduction of the Black Magus and the beautiful gesture here of the older Magus, who is worshiping God. Quentin Metzger is a painter from the north, typical goldsmith's work, and you can see the detail of the colors of the beautiful pieces that the Magi are bringing. This is typical Flemish extraordinary work. This was produced in Antwerp. And then you can see the influence of the Renaissance. We now have these columns with the grotesque that are introduced. So charming is the work by Peter Bruegel of the Adoration of the Kings in the Snow. Probably one of the first paintings that is showing snow falling. And the nativity scene is now relegated completely on the left of the painting in that houses that is in pretty bad stage. And here are coming the kings to adore Christ newly born. That way Bruegel is going to forget all the sumptuary of other works that we have seen before. He shows a kind of a modest and very, I mean, I'm just cold looking at the painting, but it's so, so well rendered. Paolo Veronese with his typical grand architecture surround is definitely influenced by Titian in the majesty of his rendering. Beautiful, as I say, architecture shows again the fact that this is the old law that is giving place to the new law and the cortege of the different magi. Rubens did this quite early on. He had just arrived from Italy in Antwerp when he was asked to make this, and this was supposed to decorate a council room where they were going to debate a peace treaty between the Dutch Republic and the Spaniards. And that painting was offered to the ambassador to be given to the king. And it's so Rubens and it's so Baroque in the grand scheme of things. It was actually worked on again in 1628 when Rubens went for the second time to Spain. He was asked to modify some things, and he added that the whole part on the right, including himself actually on one of the horses, it's a self-portrait, but shows that amazing skill he had for colors and movement and tension. Diego Velázquez, who we had met actually in Spain, this is an early work, so he's still looking at Pacheco, his teacher, and but in this he's already showing some of his great qualities. Again, we can have that intimacy. This is really part of the time when he was in Seville, and some of the influence of Flemish painters too. A lesser known Flemish painter is Leonard Bramer, is a Dutch painter, sorry, who was working for a time very close to Rembrandt. And we don't know who influenced who. So this is, but a very beautiful, very intimate work with a glowing light of the Adoration of the Magi. And then one of the later, this is mid-17th century, Nicolas Poussin, the French painter that spent most of his time in Italy of his career. And you can see the influence of the columns, the classical antiquity. This was quite often copied, but shows the more linear style of Poussin. And going back to Spain, this is the Adoration of Magi by Murillo. Murillo, of course, who is known for a lot of his scenes in the streets. And we have here not only the 3 ages of man, but the 3 region of the world. But in fact, who is the one who really gave a great importance to the nativity scenes? And of course, it was at first the tableau vivant, as we mentioned. It's actually St. Francis who is credited with creating the first nativity scene in 1223, when he went to Greccio in central Italy, where he was trying to place the emphasis of Christmas upon the worship of Christ rather than just giving gifts. Don't forget, this was the New Year. And so a lot of people were celebrating New Year, but not giving enough emphasis in the birth of Jesus. Here actually some images of Greccio nowadays, and the grotta, where the presepe, in Italian you say presepe for the nativity scene, presepio. It is from the word of Greccio that comes the name creche. So let's look at it. The story was told by both St. Bonaventura as well as Thomas of Celano. They both mentioned the fact that Francis was going to Greccio and called on John of Velita, who was a local knight, to help him in trying to make that setting. So he asked him to demonstrate, to find a way to demonstrate the inconvenience of the circumstance of Savior's birth, which means he was born in a manger with hay and an ox and donkey nearby. So when people heard about it and were quite intrigued, and so when Francis finally arrived, he was absolutely elated and rejoiced when he saw the crowd. He looked up the manger and the animals, and so he was overjoyed. The simplicity was glorified, and poverty was made rich. Humility was exalted, and Bethlehem was in grandeur. So the priest celebrated the Christian Mass. Don't forget, Francis was not a priest, but he finally, later in life, he was made a deacon, and he's shown here dressed as a deacon. And it is said that during the Mass, suddenly at the time of consecration, he saw a baby in the crib, and this became that very first for the representation of living cribs in Italy, and that tradition very quickly went on. So it gave place along the centuries to first tableau vivant, and then they decided to sculpt figures either in terracotta or in wood or media. And this is one example, a later example, of course, of a nativity scene that was made with the purpose of being displayed as a crèche at the time of Christmas. This is only one part of some of the incredible display of what we call the Neapolitan Presepio. This one is at the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, and shows not only the scene of the Nativity, but all the angels hanging around in that great backdrop, actually, of the temple. And then we have the arrival of the Magi, the young kids playing drums, and we have the shepherds and all their flocks all around. And so these are at the time were literally decorating every single church, particularly in Naples, but then all over Italy, and that spread around to other places. This is in the Art Institute of Chicago, another Neapolitan Presepio. Beautiful figures. And of course, the very known one in the Metropolitan, all 18th century works. And it displays much more than just the Magi, but you have an idea also of the scale when you see people around, by the way. But the Magi, the shepherds, but also it's going to expand to other part of everyday life. And all the angels, absolutely extraordinary, typical Baroque angels. In France, there are santons, and if you go, this is not only in churches, but also in private homes. Everybody in France, particularly in the south of France, has its own series of santons that are going to represent a lot of the everyday life in Provence that used to be, and it's passed from one generation to the other. So they build this beautiful little display with the church and all the houses in the village, and you have people selling fruits, you have the tambourinaire, which is the drummer, you have the guy carrying the flower, and the whole life of the village. And typically in each region, they had real characters. The bad people and the good people were represented. So santon. In Poland, you have another type of display. They called Shopka, and these are typically dating back to the 19th century. At the time of Christmas, people make their very own display, and they're taken from house to house and shown, and they make contests. So very proud of their works, architectural and then figurative, and some are actually mechanized. This is a display at the Church of São Lourenço, Portugal, and I apologize for my very bad Portuguese accent. So it's Lourenço, I assume. I don't know how to pronounce. Now, in the Czech Republic, they have a particular tradition. This is, by the way, was made by stocking weaver Tomáš Krysa, who was a burgher from a city in South Bohemian region of the Czech Republic. He worked on the crèche that you see there for 60 years. The scene covers about 60 square meters. It contains 1,389 figures of human and animals, of which 133 are movable. And he uses all kinds of material. The oldest part is the Nativity scene. And then he went on doing others. As you can see, everyday life, the old trades are shown in the old part, and even the castle with the knights. This is in a museum by now. But it's interesting that it is that tradition which is going to be brought to the US and is credited to be some of the very first rendering of nativity scenes in the US, started in the 18th century with some Protestant immigrants that were brought their Christmas custom with them. They were called the Moravians, and they had with them these, what they call puts, that are these little display of everyday life. And this is apparently what gave really habit once other people emigrated and saw what they were doing, they brought their own tradition. And that has become such a very, very traditional thing in the US. And then finally in Germany, particularly in the south of Germany, they were doing carving wood figures. And these are rather large figures. They probably about 12, 13 inches high, and they sculpted wood, and then they would be dressed up. So on that nice image, I want to wish you happy holidays, and I'm going to reopen the forum to questions or comments or whatever. So happy holidays to all of you.
Same to you. Thank you.
Joyous Noel.
Joyeux Noël. Joyeux Noël.
Oh,
Any questions?
Wonderful. Thank you. This is Jean. Thank you.
Okay, but I'm happy you enjoyed.
this is
Thank you,
Cynthia.
Anne.
I just adored this.
Thank you very
presentation.
much.
It's so much fun. Thank you so much.
Loved it.
Thank you.
But you've
Happy
seen
holidays, Anne.
more
Thank
than
you,
what
Anne.
you see. What I like is that we take it for granted, but in fact there are so many things that have evolved and had meanings, different meanings. So
And
John, question.
Anne, this is Betty Heenan.
Betty.
Yes, I would like to get your address again. I know I have it, but I want to send you a card from John and I.
Okay, I will send you, I'm not going to tell you that now. I will send it. Okay.
Okay, tell us on,
I will send you an email.
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
And thank you very much. This was excellent, excellent.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I hope I fill your eyes with beauty.
Thank you, Anne. Happy holidays. Blessings.
Okay. Wonderful. But
And thank you so much. I